Chapter 1. The Mind That Refuses One Path. There is a specific kind of tension that appears in certain minds long before it is understood. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive as crisis. It shows itself quietly as restlessness that has no obvious cause, as dissatisfaction that cannot be explained by failure or lack of opportunity. Even when life appears to move forward in acceptable ways, something inside remains unsettled. This tension often confuses both the individual and the people around them. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. Progress is visible. Ability is evident. Yet internally, the mind feels compressed, as though it is being asked to reduce itself into a shape that does not quite fit. The discomfort does not come from difficulty, but from narrowing. Some minds experience clarity through limitation. They feel relief when options are reduced. Direction provides safety. For other minds, limitation produces unease. When options disappear, curiosity tightens rather than settles. These minds do not experience narrowing as focus, they experience it as loss. This difference is rarely acknowledged. Most cultures quietly assume that clarity is universal, that choosing one direction is the natural endpoint of development. The person who commits early, specializes deeply, and remains consistent is seen as mature. Movement, exploration, and change are treated as phases that should eventually end. For a multi-interest mind, this assumption creates friction. The mind does not resist commitment itself. It resists premature closure. It senses that meaning does not reside inside a single role or discipline, but across connections formed over time. Learning feels incomplete when it is isolated. Identity feels artificial when it is compressed into a single label. Early on, this resistance is not intellectual, it is felt. The child moves from interest to interest without guilt. Attention follows curiosity naturally. There is no need to justify exploration, because no justification is demanded. The mind operates in its natural state, fluid, associative, and open. The conflict begins when this movement is interrupted by expectation. Slowly, subtly, the environment introduces evaluation. Interests are compared. Some are praised more than others. Some are described as useful, others as distractions. The mind begins to receive feedback not about its curiosity, but about its direction. This is where the refusal of one path begins to acquire meaning. What was once simple exploration becomes interpreted as indecision. What was once curiosity becomes reframed as lack of focus. The individual may not consciously agree with these interpretations, but they absorb them emotionally. Over time, these messages shape self-perception. The mind starts to monitor itself. Before following a new interest, it asks whether this interest makes sense, whether it aligns with a future plan, whether it will be perceived as serious. Curiosity no longer moves freely, it hesitates, it checks itself. This hesitation creates tension because the impulse to explore remains present. This internal monitoring is exhausting, not because exploration is difficult, but because suppression requires constant effort. The mind expends energy preventing itself from moving, rather than using energy to integrate what it learns. Over time, this leads to a subtle form of fatigue that is difficult to explain. Many people misinterpret this fatigue as laziness or lack of discipline. In reality, it is the cost of sustained internal resistance. The mind is working against its own orientation. Instead of flowing toward understanding, it is held in place by expectation. As adulthood approaches, this tension intensifies. Choices begin to carry weight. Paths are framed as permanent. Decisions are no longer presented as experiments, but as commitments that will define identity. For minds that require exploration to understand themselves, this creates anxiety rather than clarity. The question is no longer what interests me, but what should I choose? The mind shifts from internal signal to external strategy. It attempts to predict which choice will be safest, most acceptable, most respected. This predictive effort distances the individual further from their natural curiosity. The refusal to choose one path is often misunderstood as fear of responsibility. In reality, it is often fear of self-erasure. The mind senses that choosing too narrowly will require abandoning parts of itself that feel essential. This is not immaturity, it is self-preservation. Identity becomes the central struggle. Modern identity is constructed through occupation, expertise, and continuity. People are encouraged to describe themselves through what they do, not how they think. For a mind that thinks across domains, this creates a persistent sense of incompleteness. No single description feels accurate. Each label captures a fragment, but not the whole. Over time, this leads to discomfort in social contexts. Simple questions about work or direction feel loaded. Answers feel insufficient. The individual may begin to avoid explaining themselves altogether. This avoidance further isolates the mind. When identity cannot be easily communicated, it becomes private. The individual may appear adaptable or agreeable, while internally feeling unseen. This gap between internal complexity and external simplicity becomes another source of tension. The refusal of one path is not always visible. Often the individual complies outwardly. They choose a career, they commit to a role, they appear settled. But inside, curiosity remains active. Interests continue to emerge. Ideas continue to connect. The mind does not stop moving simply because it has chosen a position. This creates a double life: outward stability, inward restlessness. Over time, this distance between these two states becomes harder to sustain. The individual may experience sudden dissatisfaction, unexpected career changes, or periods of disengagement that seem irrational from the outside. These shifts are often judged harshly. People ask why stability was abandoned. They assume something went wrong. Rarely do they consider that the stability itself may have been misaligned with the mind's structure. It is important to understand that refusing one path does not mean refusing depth. Multi-interest minds are capable of deep engagement. In fact, when allowed to integrate multiple domains, their depth can exceed that of narrow specialization. Their understanding is built through synthesis rather than accumulation. Depth for these minds is not achieved by staying in one place. It is achieved by returning to ideas from different angles, over time, through different contexts. Each return adds nuance. Each connection adds meaning. This process is slower to recognize, but richer in outcome. The tragedy occurs when this process is interrupted too early. When the mind is forced to remain in a single frame, integration cannot occur. Knowledge becomes brittle. Engagement fades. The individual may continue performing, but the inner sense of coherence weakens. This loss of coherence is often described as burnout or loss of motivation. While those terms are accurate, they do not capture the root cause. The issue is not workload, it is misalignment between mental structure and imposed expectation. The mind that refuses one path is not rejecting structure, it is rejecting confinement. It seeks a form of structure that allows movement, connection, and evolution over time. When such structure is absent, resistance becomes the only option. Understanding this reframes the entire narrative. The question shifts from why can this person not commit to what kind of commitment allows this mind to remain intact. This shift is subtle but profound. It replaces judgment with inquiry. The refusal of one path is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a signal. It points toward a different way of learning, working, and constructing identity. Ignoring this signal does not eliminate it. It only drives it underground, where it re-emerges later as dissatisfaction, confusion, or quiet resentment. This chapter will continue to explore this signal, not to romanticize it, but to understand it fully. Only through understanding can the mind stop fighting itself. As the mind moves deeper into adulthood, the refusal to choose one path begins to interact with time. Time changes the meaning of decisions. What once felt like exploration now feels like delay. What once felt flexible now feels risky. The same curiosity that once brought excitement begins to carry weight. This shift is not internal at first. It is imposed through comparison. Peers begin to settle into identities that look stable from the outside. Titles become consistent. Trajectories become visible. Progress is measured not by understanding, but by continuity. The multi-interest mind notices this contrast and begins to question itself. The question is rarely framed clearly. It does not ask, "Is this path right for me?" Instead, it asks, "Why am I not progressing the way others are?" This question quietly replaces curiosity with self-surveillance. The mind begins tracking its movement not by interest, but by deviation. Comparison creates distortion. It compresses complexity into timelines. It assumes that visible stability equals internal clarity. For many people, this may be true. For others, it is an illusion. Yet the illusion is powerful because it is rewarded publicly. The multi-interest mind experiences this as pressure to resolve itself. It feels an unspoken deadline approaching, a sense that exploration must end, that identity must harden. This urgency rarely produces clarity. It produces anxiety. Anxiety narrows perception. It pushes the mind towards safe choices rather than meaningful ones. When anxiety leads decision-making, curiosity is treated as a threat. Interests that feel expansive are postponed. Safer paths are chosen not because they resonate, but because they promise relief from uncertainty. This relief is temporary. The mind may settle into a role, but the underlying structure remains unchanged. Curiosity does not disappear. It becomes quieter, more cautious, sometimes hidden even from the individual themselves. The mind learns to compartmentalize. Compartmentalization allows survival, but it fragments identity. Parts of the self are expressed publicly, others privately, others not at all. Over time, the individual may lose awareness of what has been suppressed. Interests fade not because they are unimportant, but because attending to them feels dangerous. This danger is not physical, it is psychological. It threatens the sense of stability that has been constructed through compromise. To reawaken curiosity feels like risking collapse. The mind avoids this risk by narrowing attention further. This is where the refusal of one path becomes misunderstood even by the person experiencing it. The individual may believe they have finally chosen. They may feel relieved at first, yet beneath the surface, something remains unresolved. The unresolved tension often manifests indirectly. It appears as irritability, fatigue, or lack of motivation. It may show up as procrastination that feels irrational, or as sudden attraction to new ideas that seem disruptive. These are not signs of failure, they are signs of internal misalignment. The mind is signaling that something essential has been ignored, but without language to understand the signal, the individual often responds with discipline. They attempt to work harder, commit deeper, eliminate distraction. These efforts may succeed temporarily, but they do not resolve the underlying conflict. The refusal to choose one path is not always conscious. Sometimes it emerges as resistance to repetition. Tasks that once felt manageable begin to feel heavy. The mind struggles not because the work is difficult, but because it feels closed. There is no sense of expansion, no movement toward understanding. Closed systems exhaust curiosity-driven minds. When there is nothing left to explore, attention withers. The individual may interpret this as boredom or lack of passion. In reality, it is a signal that integration has stalled. Integration is a key concept for understanding this mind. Integration is the process by which diverse experiences are woven into coherence. It requires movement across domains. It requires time. It cannot be rushed. When integration is prevented, experiences remain fragmented. Fragmentation feels unsettling. The individual carries knowledge, skills, and insights that never quite connect. They sense potential, but cannot locate it. This creates a quiet form of grief, mourning possibilities that were never allowed to mature. This grief is rarely acknowledged. Society does not recognize loss of self as legitimate loss. There is no ritual for abandoned curiosity. There is no validation for paths not taken by necessity rather than choice. As a result, the individual often turns the grief inward. They blame themselves for lack of consistency. They assume they have failed to become someone coherent. This self-blame deepens the original misunderstanding. The refusal to choose one path is often framed as indecision, but indecision implies inability to decide. In many cases, the individual has decided many times. They have simply discovered that each decision excludes too much of themselves. This discovery is painful. It forces the mind to confront a difficult truth. The available structures do not accommodate its complexity. The problem is not choice itself, but the expectation that choice must be singular and permanent. When permanence is imposed too early, it creates fear rather than commitment. Commitment thrives when it feels reversible, adaptive, and responsive to learning. For multi-interest minds, commitment deepens when it allows evolution. The refusal of one path is therefore not resistance to responsibility, it is resistance to rigidity. The mind is asking for a structure that can change as understanding grows. This request is rarely articulated. It is felt as discomfort, restlessness, or dissatisfaction. Without interpretation, these feelings are treated as defects. The individual attempts to eliminate them rather than understand them. Understanding changes the experience entirely. When the refusal to choose one path is recognized as a signal rather than a flaw, the internal struggle softens. The mind stops fighting itself. Curiosity is no longer seen as sabotage, but as guidance. This does not remove difficulty, it removes confusion. The individual can begin asking better questions, not which path should I choose forever, but what kind of structure allows me to remain whole while moving forward. This chapter continues to build toward that understanding. The refusal of one path is not the end of clarity. It is the beginning of a different kind of clarity, one that emerges through integration rather than exclusion. When the refusal to choose one path remains unresolved over long periods, it begins to shape the inner landscape of the mind in more subtle and lasting ways. What started as tension becomes pattern. What once felt like temporary discomfort turns into a background state that follows the individual through years of adult life. One of the earliest consequences is a gradual erosion of trust in internal signals. Curiosity, once reliable, begins to feel unreliable. Interest feels suspicious. Motivation feels unpredictable. The individual learns not to trust what draws them forward because past attractions have been labeled impractical or immature. This distrust does not silence curiosity, it distorts it. Interests arise, but they are immediately questioned. The mind second-guesses itself before engagement begins. Exploration becomes conditional. Only interests that appear justifiable are allowed attention. This filtering process weakens the relationship between the individual and their own mind. Decisions are no longer guided by resonance, but by defensibility. The person asks whether an interest can be explained, monetized, or legitimized before asking whether it matters. Over time, this creates a sense of internal emptiness that is difficult to articulate. The individual may be busy, productive, and externally functional, yet feel disconnected from their own effort. Work becomes something that is done, not something that is inhabited. This disconnection often leads to burnout that seems disproportionate to workload. The person may not be overworked in the traditional sense. Hours may be reasonable, tasks may be manageable, yet exhaustion accumulates because energy is spent maintaining alignment with an external structure rather than moving with internal coherence. Burnout in this context is not collapse, it is dulling. The mind becomes quieter, less curious, less responsive. Enthusiasm fades. The individual may interpret this as maturity or realism, but something essential has been lost. This loss is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment where curiosity disappears. Instead, it thins. Interests feel weaker. Ideas feel flatter. The mind adapts by lowering expectation. It stops asking for fulfillment and settles for stability. This adaptation is often praised. The individual appears grounded. They are no longer restless. They are reliable. Yet beneath this surface calm, there may be a quiet grief, a sense that life has become smaller than it once promised. This grief is not about missed success. It is about missed self. The person may feel that parts of them were never allowed to develop fully. Talents were paused. Curiosities were postponed indefinitely. Over time, postponement becomes abandonment. Abandonment carries guilt. The individual may feel they have betrayed themselves, yet they cannot identify when or how. There is no clear choice to point to, only a gradual narrowing that felt necessary at the time. This guilt often turns inward. Instead of questioning the structure that demanded narrowing, the individual questions their own resilience. They assume they should have adapted better. They assume others have done so successfully, and that their own discomfort indicates weakness. This assumption deepens isolation. The individual feels alone in their experience, unaware that many others share the same quiet struggle. Because the struggle is internal, it rarely finds language. People do not gather around unspoken dissatisfaction. As years pass, the refusal to choose one path may re-emerge in unexpected ways. A sudden interest appears that feels alive in a way nothing else has for a long time. The individual may experience a surge of energy that feels both exciting and threatening. This resurgence is often met with fear. The individual worries that following this interest will disrupt the stability they have worked hard to maintain. They may suppress it quickly, telling themselves it is unrealistic or irresponsible. When this happens repeatedly, curiosity becomes associated with danger. Interest feels destabilizing. The mind learns to avoid excitement because excitement threatens the fragile equilibrium that has been built. This avoidance creates a life that is safe but narrow. The individual may function well within it, yet feel strangely absent from their own existence. Days pass smoothly, but without texture. Time feels flattened. Flattened time is one of the most painful outcomes of prolonged misalignment. When curiosity is active, time feels dimensional. Learning creates depth. Experiences accumulate meaning. When curiosity is suppressed, time feels repetitive. Days blur together. Life feels shorter. This experience is rarely discussed openly. People often assume that dissatisfaction with stability indicates ingratitude. They believe one should be thankful for security, not restless within it. As a result, the individual keeps these feelings private. Privacy turns struggle into identity. The person begins to see themselves as someone who is never quite satisfied. They may believe this trait is inherently negative. They may attempt to correct it through discipline, mindfulness, or forced acceptance. While these efforts may reduce distress temporarily, they do not address the core issue. The core issue is not dissatisfaction, it is misalignment between how the mind generates meaning and the structures it is asked to inhabit. The refusal to choose one path, when understood correctly, is not resistance to life. It is resistance to a life that does not allow integration. The mind is asking for continuity of curiosity, not endless novelty. This distinction is critical. Many people confuse integration with accumulation. They assume multi-interest minds want to collect experiences endlessly. In reality, these minds seek coherence. They want their interests to speak to each other. They want learning to form a narrative. When forced into narrow continuity, this narrative cannot form. Experiences remain isolated. Skills remain underused. Insights remain private. The mind senses this fragmentation and responds with discomfort. The early seeds of peace appear when this fragmentation is recognized, not resolved, but recognized. Awareness does not change circumstances immediately, but it changes interpretation. The individual stops viewing their discomfort as personal failure and begins seeing it as informational. Information invites curiosity rather than judgment. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" the mind asks, "What is this pointing toward?" This shift creates space. Space allows reflection. Reflection allows choice. Choice in this context does not mean choosing one path. It means choosing how to relate to one's own nature. It means deciding whether to continue fighting internal signals or to listen to them with patience. The refusal to choose one path does not disappear with understanding. What changes is the quality of the refusal. It becomes quieter, less defensive, more intentional. The mind no longer resists blindly. It waits, observes, and prepares for integration. This is not the end of struggle. It is the end of confusion, and that distinction matters more than it initially appears. At some point, usually after years of quiet resistance, the multi-interest mind begins to search not for escape, but for explanation. The question shifts subtly. It is no longer, "Why am I unable to settle?" but "Why does settling feel like disappearance?" This shift marks the beginning of a more honest relationship with the self. Reframing is not denial. It does not pretend that difficulty disappears once understood. What reframing offers is context. Context changes the emotional weight of experience. When the refusal to choose one path is placed within a psychological framework rather than a moral one, shame begins to loosen its grip. The mind starts to recognize patterns that were previously experienced as chaos. Interests did not arrive randomly. Shifts were not impulsive. They followed internal logic, periods of growth, saturation, integration, and renewal. The mind begins to see its history not as failure, but as movement. This recognition creates space for acceptance, though acceptance does not mean resignation. Acceptance means allowing the mind to be observed without immediate correction. It means suspending the urge to fix, narrow, or discipline oneself into compliance. For many, this is deeply uncomfortable. The instinct to control has been reinforced for years. Letting go of that control feels risky. Yet control has not produced peace, it has only produced temporary stability followed by deeper dissatisfaction. Acceptance allows the mind to breathe. Curiosity, long treated as dangerous, is allowed to surface again, not as a command, but as signal. The individual learns to observe interest without acting on it immediately. This observation itself becomes calming. This is where the foundation for sustainable identity begins to form. Identity shifts from something that must be declared to something that can be lived. Instead of defining oneself by a single role, the individual begins to recognize patterns of engagement, ways of thinking, ways of connecting ideas. This form of identity is less visible but more stable. It does not depend on constant external validation. It evolves as understanding deepens. It allows for continuity without rigidity. The mind also begins to reinterpret commitment. Commitment is no longer equated with permanence. It becomes associated with presence. One can commit deeply to a period of learning, a project, or a role without assuming it must define the rest of one's life. This reframing removes much of the fear surrounding choice. When choices are seen as chapters rather than conclusions, curiosity no longer feels like betrayal. Movement becomes part of continuity rather than a break from it. Importantly, acceptance does not eliminate external pressure. The world still rewards specialization. Systems still prefer clarity. The difference is internal. The individual no longer uses these systems as mirrors for self-worth. This internal separation is subtle but powerful. The mind stops asking whether it is acceptable and starts asking whether it is coherent. Coherence replaces approval as the guiding principle. Coherence does not require explaining everything. It requires understanding oneself well enough to tolerate ambiguity. The mind learns that it does not need to resolve its nature immediately. It can allow understanding to unfold gradually. This patience changes how tension is experienced. Restlessness becomes information rather than irritation. Dissatisfaction becomes a signal rather than a verdict. The mind no longer panics at its own movement. Over time, this creates a quieter form of confidence, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of trust. Trust in one's ability to adapt, integrate, and find meaning across time. This trust does not prevent difficulty, it prevents self-abandonment. Even when choices are constrained, the individual maintains internal alignment. They know what they are doing and why, even if the explanation is incomplete. The refusal to choose one path remains present, but it is no longer adversarial. It becomes a compass rather than a wall. It points toward integration, not escape. This chapter does not offer resolution, because resolution would be dishonest. What it offers is grounding, a way to understand the refusal not as resistance to life, but as an insistence on living without internal fragmentation. The chapters that follow will build on this foundation. They will explore how curiosity operates, how attention moves, how identity is shaped, and how sustainable structures can be created without betraying the mind's nature. But everything begins here, with permission to understand oneself without judgment.